Chapter 15. The citadel's large feasting chamber was separated from the keep's entry hall by a long passageway that essentially took one huge room and separated a third of its length into a separate space opposite the keep's tall double doors. As Malus and the water party cut across the passage, the Highborn could see grey sunshine slanting through the open doorway and painting a faint square of light on the sand-strewn floor. The dead light of the wastes had never looked so welcoming before. He and Alvar had just stepped into the entryway when the darkness around them erupted in howls and bestial roars, and broad, bare feet slapped across the slate tiles. Malus caught a glimpse of a huge, horned, muscular form rearing up in the lantern light. Then a heavy club smashed into his left vambrace and threw the lantern from his hands. The Highborn retreated, raising his sword as a lantern shattered on the tiles, scattering burning oil across the floor. Malus's attacker let out another inhuman roar and rushed at the Highborn with his club held high. The weak light of the burning oil gleamed on a broad, heavily muscled chest fringed with black, wiry hair and powerful furred legs that terminated in large hooves. The monster was close to 7 feet tall and looked far stronger than any Druki, and moved with the speed of a plains lion. As fast as the monster was, though, the Highborn was faster still. The man-beast charged. Malus leapt forwards as well, ducking beneath the monster's thick arms and stabbing his sword deep into its belly. The sword pierced the monster's thick wall of abdominal muscle, and the power of its charge forced the blade through its body, grating against its spine as it punched out through the creature's back. The man-beast bellowed in shock and anger, doubling up around the Druki sword, but his left hand reached over and caught Malus by the hair. It flung him backwards against the nearby wall. The Highborn's head struck the stone and sparks exploded across his vision. Then came the creature's club, smashing against his thick breastplate, and Malus thought he'd been kicked in the chest by a god. Malus bounced off the stone wall and fell to the ground, gasping for air. The armor plate was the only thing that had saved him, and even then he could tell that the tough, flexible steel was deeply dented just to the left of his heart. The club smashed down again, this time striking the wall and part of his shoulder, and the joint flared with a sharp spike of pain. Malus cried out in pain and anger, fumbling a long dagger from a sheath in his boot. When the man-beast lifted his club once more, Malus leapt from the ground and grappled the huge creature, stabbing again and again into the monster's chest and throat. The monster roared, its mouth right above the Highborn's left ear. Malus could smell the thing's fetid breath, and was battered by the tips of thick tusks or horns as the creature tossed its head in pain. Hot, bitter blood washed down the monster's chest, and its bellows turned to a choking rattle. Once again, the monster's broad, calloused hand grabbed Malus by the hair and neck and tried to pull him free, but the Highborn snarled in pain and held on, driving the knife again and again into the man-beast's body. The heavy club tumbled to the floor, but the Highborn's triumph was short-lived as the beast smashed its right fist into the side of his head. Once, twice, and then a third time, that sent him sprawling across the floor. Stunned and disorientated, Malus scrambled to regain his feet. There were shouts and screams echoing in the empty room, and the beasts seemed to be everywhere. A fur-covered figure crashed into him, bearing him down, and the Highborn sank his teeth into the thing's torn and bloody throat before he realized that it was in its death throes. A moment later, the man-beast died, and Malus rolled the creature off himself. His sword was still buried to the hilt in his abdomen. The ambush was as brief as it was brutal. As Malus recovered his senses, he saw another monster topple onto the still burning oil, but the dagger protruding from the creature's eye spared the beast the agony of burning alive. 2 other creatures sped in front of the flickering light, arms and legs flashing as they ran for the open doorway. "Stop!" Malus roared as they ran headlong into the courtyard, and the Highborn staggered to his feet in pursuit. An Auglier bellowed a challenge just as Malus reached the doorway. The beast men, for there was no better term to describe them, stood frozen in place just a few feet from the doors as 7 Cold Ones stalked their way. The Cold Ones were fanning out in a rough semicircle to surround and pin their prey against the wall of the tower. "Stand!" Malus commanded, his voice crackling with authority. All 7 of the war beasts paused, their training briefly overcoming instinct. The beastmen turned at the sound of his voice and fell to their knees, bleating words in a language Malus had never heard before. In the grey light of day, the Highborn saw that the creatures were both powerfully built and covered with black fur, except across their biceps and chest. Their legs ended in glossy black hooves, and their fingers were tipped in thick claw-like nails. The beastmen had heads like great rams, with black eyes and heavy, curved horns that sprouted from their foreheads and hung down to their chests. One wore a bracelet of crude, beaten gold around his right wrist, while the other had a necklace of bone and assorted feathers hanging around his thick neck. As far as Malus could tell, the twisted creatures were pleading for their lives. Vanir and one of Dalvar's men came from the gatehouse at a dead run, crossbows in their hands. The side of Malus's face throbbed, and blood dripped on his neck from deep gouges in his cheek and ear. The rest of the water party stumbled out into the light, many covered in blood themselves. "How many attackers?" Malus asked. Dalvar shook his head, pressing a hand to a cut on his cheek. Lunara wiped her hair from her eyes. 5, all told. Those 2 ran as soon as they realized they were the only ones left. Malus turned to Vanir. "What are they?" he said, pointing to the 2 creatures. The retainer shrugged. "Beastmen?" As the Highborn's expression paled with rage, Vanir quickly added, "The Arturi say they live in loose tribes in the farther reaches of the wastes, where their mystical energies warp their bodies into blasphemous shapes. They sometimes raid our watchtowers along the frontier, but the Shades slay any that trespass in the hills." "Can you speak their language?" "Certainly not, my lord," Vanir replied, offended by the very idea. "I don't think even the Arturi understand them." "Then they aren't of much use to me besides sport," Malus growled. "Why do you suppose they are here?" "I'm a knight of the Hag, my lord, not some damned oracle," Vanir said archly. "If I had to guess, I would suppose they were fugitives of some kind. Those beasts typically travel in bands 100 strong. For one reason or another, these are far away from their litter mates." Malus rubbed his chin thoughtfully, wincing as the motion set his torn ear to aching. "They're from the farther north, you said?" Vanir nodded. "Farther north than here, at least." The Highborn eyed the beastmen speculatively, then strode quickly over to Spite's side. He fumbled through his saddlebag and produced the wire-wrapped skull. Malus returned to the 2 creatures and showed the relic to them both. "Kul Hadar?" Malus asked. "Kul Hadar?" One of the beastmen let out a cry of surprise. "Hadar! Hadar!" it grunted, pointing at the skull, then gobbled out a long string of gibberish. Malus smiled. "That's better." He turned to his men. "It appears we have a guide," he said, pointing to the babbling creature. "That one lives. The other one will entertain us tonight." The Druki smiled, their eyes glittering at the prospect of an evening's flirtation with darkness. One night revelry would be good for morale. Tomorrow, Malus felt, they would be at the edge of the forest that skirted the mountain. And then Kul Hadar, he thought, smiling with anticipation. Are you certain? Malus asked, feeling a fist close about his heart. The Druki looked from Dalvar to Malus, clearly nervous at earning the Highborn's undivided attention. Yes, my lord. The nomads wore furs, but these riders had on black cloaks and rode proper horses. Malus stepped to the closest gatehouse window. The sun had only just cleared the horizon, and already hot gusts of dusty wind blew against his face. From this height, he could see a long way past the broken walls and across the desolate plain. How far would you say? The retainer shrugged helplessly. Half a day, my lord. Less than 5 miles, I think. I only caught a glimpse as the sunlight silhouetted them along one of the ridgelines. The way distances are warped here. Who can say for certain? Uriel's riders must have followed us through the White Hollows, Dalvar said, his face paling. You don't suppose they fought their way through the Whites? Perhaps, Malus growled. Or perhaps they're close enough to being dead themselves that the Whites couldn't tell the difference. It doesn't matter. We're leaving. Now! The Highborn headed swiftly for the stairs. Out in the courtyard, the warband was saddling the Cold Ones for the day's travel. For the first time in days, the warriors were talking easily among themselves, their humour improved by the entertainment of the previous night. The Beastman hung from an improvised rack they'd built with steel bars taken from the old forge. The creature's prodigious endurance had prolonged the revels well into the early morning hours, until, drunk with torture and running short of time, the warband had adopted much cruder tactics to bring the celebrations to an end. The Beastman now resembled nothing so much as a badly butchered slab of meat, its blood staining the sand around the rack. The surviving Beastman didn't seem overly troubled by the death of its companion. It had watched the revels with some curiosity once he'd been persuaded that he wasn't about to be the next victim. Now it stood among the Druki as they loaded the animals, running its hand along its arms and chest with a troubled look on its face. It had taken a large amount of the Noglir slime to cover his scent so the Cold Ones would accept him. Malus hoped they hadn't accidentally poisoned their guide. Lenara and Dalvar alike tried to tie the Beastman's hands, but Malus had prevented them, despite their heated objections. He wanted the creature to think they were potential allies, not captors. If the Beastman thought it had a chance of being released when they reached Kul Hadar, it would be more inclined to cooperate and get the whole thing over with. Plus, the Highborn hoped it sent a signal to the creature. It doesn't matter to us if you try to run. You can't escape us, no matter what you try. They were almost ready. Malus considered the dead Beastman. It would be easy enough to pull the corpse down and conceal it in one of the buildings. After a moment's thought, he shrugged in resignation. Let the riders find the body and traces that they'd been here. With luck, they would search the rest of the city for them and waste precious time while the Druki escaped. Sahanesha! He cried. Mount up! We leave in 5 minutes! The warband immediately bent themselves to finishing their last-minute tasks. Malus gathered Spite's saddle and headed for his mount. Lenara was waiting for him, her expression troubled. What happened, my lord? Uriel's riders, he said with a grunt as he threw the heavy saddle over Spite's back. The sentry thinks he saw them on the plains, about half a day's ride away. I want to put as much distance between them and us as possible. The retainer muttered a curse under her breath. She eyed the Beastman warily. Do you think you can trust it? I think after what it saw last night, it knows that it'll be next until it gives me exactly what I want. That was a wise decision last night, my lord. The men seem much improved. Lenara glanced sidelong at him as Malus tightened the saddle's girth strap. Or does this have something to do with the conversation you had with Dalvar underneath the keep? Malus grinned. Clever girl. A bit of both, I think. Dalva and I have come to an understanding of sorts. He and his men have sworn themselves to me. To you? What of Nagaira? They've seen enough to believe that my dear sister has washed her hands of them. Thus, they no longer consider themselves in her employ. Your sister will not be pleased. At this point, I am beyond caring what my dear sister thinks. Malus stood and leaned close to her. It's possible that this is all an elaborate scheme to punish both Uriel and myself. She sent me out here with my brother's precious relic in the hopes that I'll be lost forever. Lenara looked grim. So far, I'd say she's succeeding. So why continue this fool's errand? Why not head back for the Hag? Because Uriel is there, and my former allies, and their contract with the temple. Malus hissed. Nagaira has thought this through carefully. If I stay here in the wastes, I die. If I return empty-handed, I die. The only way out is through the temple. I must succeed, or I'm finished. You're assuming there even is a temple? All you have to go on is what your sister told you? Not so, Malus said. He pointed to the Beastman. That thing knows where Kul Hadar is, and that's where we're going. Lenara opened her mouth to protest, but she knew the implacable look in Malus's eye all too well. As you wish, my lord, she said with a sigh. I only hope the rest of us survive to celebrate your triumph. The bleak look on Lenara's face elicited a sharp laugh from Malus. Fear not, terrible one, he said, not unkindly. If I want you to die, I'll kill you myself. Now, mount up and let's be gone. They reached the outskirts of the city within the hour, navigating ponderously over piles of fallen stone and shifting mounds of sand. There was no northern gate, as it happened. The warband was forced to seek out a large enough section of collapsed wall and clamber their way over the rubble. The dark mountain loomed in the distance, shrouded by drifts of wind-borne dust. Malus turned to the Beastman, who rode on Lenara's Noglier, just behind the retainer's saddle. The Highborn wasn't certain who appeared more uncomfortable with the arrangement, the Cold One, Lenara, or their erstwhile guide. Kul Hadar? Malus inquired. The guide pointed a clawed finger, off to the northwest, seemingly away from the cleft peak. Hadar! The creature grunted, then added more in his guttural speech. Malus gazed from the mountain to the direction indicated by the Beastman. It made no sense. But this is the wastes, he thought. Besides, what's the point of having a guide if you don't follow his directions? All right, the Highborn said to the creature. But remember your packmate back in the keep. That's what happens to those who aren't any more use to me. From the look in the Beastman's eye, the creature may not have understood the words, but the meaning was clear enough. Hadar! The Beastman replied, more forcefully this time, pointing to the northwest. Malus tugged on the reins and pointed Spite away from the mountain. This makes as much sense as anything, I suppose, he muttered and spurred the Noglier into a trot. They reached the forest by nightfall. For the entire day the mountain rose from their left, never receding, but at the same time growing no closer. The warband rode through desolate plains of shifting dust and grit, passing the occasional withered tree or empty lakebed. As the sun sank low in the west, the terrain began to slope slightly upward, and the vegetation became more abundant. The hot, sulphurous wind tapered off, and before they knew it, the Druki were riding across rolling hills thick with underbrush and scraggly black-leaf trees. Unseen animals hissed and chattered in their wake, and once a creature with broad, leathery wings burst from the scrub and soared away to the north, screaming its agitation at the intruders. Malus was starting to look for possible campsites when Spite crested a tall hill and he found himself staring at the outskirts of the elusive forest. Beyond rose the great mountain, its deep wound standing out as a line of abyssal blackness against the steel grey of its flanks. For a moment, Malus couldn't believe his own eyes. When had their course begun curving back towards the peak? Try as he might, he could not remember.
No matter, he thought. We're here.
Lunara sidled her cold one up alongside Spite.
Do we camp here, my lord?
The daylight was almost spent, but the northern auroras were already boiling across the sky in the most vivid display Malus had ever seen. Streaks and great loops of blue and red and violet arced across the underside of the clouds, casting unsteady shadows among the tall trees.
We'll press on a bit longer, the Highborn decided at length. Uriel's riders have no need for sleep, I suspect. I want to cover as much ground as possible while there's light to see by.
Somewhere deep in the woods, a creature gave out a long, gruff howl. The Cold One shifted uneasily, and Malus could feel Spite gathering his wind for a response until he quieted the beast with a jab of the spurs. He looked to the Beastman.
Kul Hadar!
The Beastman sat with its shoulders hunched, apparently unnerved by the strange howl. Reluctantly, it pointed straight ahead, into the shadowy wood.
All right then,
Malus said, raising his hand to motion the warband forward and then reaching back for his crossbow. There were a number of well-known paths through the wood, wide enough for even Cold One riders to traverse through them in single file with ease. The tall oaks and cedars blocked much of the light from the auroras with their spreading branches. But colonies of green and blue fungus climbed the boles of many of the trees and gave off a faint luminescence that revealed enough of the path to navigate by. The small column moved slowly amid a preternatural stillness. No night animals disturbed the silence with their cries, an observation that set Malus's nerve on edge. They had been riding beneath the trees for more than an hour when they heard the howl again. Once again, it was off to the west, but it seemed somewhat closer than before. Whatever made the long, hungry cry had to be huge, the Highborn thought. As loud and as lengthy as the sound was. Something as big as a Cold One. Or possibly bigger, he thought. Then another howl came, also from the west, but this time from a different source. It sounded a bit farther away than its predecessor, but still too close for comfort. Now another barking cry, from the east, and Malus grew concerned.
A pack, he thought, and they sound like they're hunting.
Spite shifted uneasily beneath him, and one of their other Cold Ones let out a low groan. Malus spurred his mount into a trot, his eyes straining to pick out the path ahead.
Perhaps if we can just escape their path.
For a few minutes, nothing broke the forest silence, save the heavy pad, pad, pad of Spite's tread. But then another howl broke the stillness, and less than a mile to the west came a splintering crack, like a tree broken by a passage of something swift and powerful. It was answered by another howl to the east, and then another.
4 of them,
Malus thought.
And they have our scent.
They couldn't go any faster in the darkness. The trees hung too close and the light was too poor. Malus could hear huge forms crashing through the forest on either side of the path behind them. Ponderous steps of 2, 4, and even 3-legged gates. And then silence. Malus halted the column, his senses straining to penetrate the thick shadows all around. There was nothing save the heavy breathing of the Cold Ones. The Highborn turned to look back at Lunara. The retainer's face was tense, but the Beastman behind her looked almost mad with fear.
We can't outrun them, Malus thought. Perhaps we can stand our ground and drive them off.
He reined Spite around and began to nose, his way back down the length of the column.
"Crossbows ready,"
he said to each of the Druki he passed. The warrior at the end of the column was the same Druki who had stood watch in the gatehouse the night before. Malus edged alongside him.
"See anything?"
The Druki peered back the way they'd come, his face pale.
No,
he whispered.
but I can hear them. They're shifting about back there in the darkness behind the trees.
Now Malus could hear them too. Huge shapes pacing slowly and carefully in the shadows, perhaps 50 yards back along the path. He strained his eyes to penetrate the gloom, but to no avail. The glow generated by the fungus only deepened the shadows beyond the trees, and whatever the creatures were, they were cautious and cunning.
"They're sizing us up,"
Malus said, half to himself.
"trying to decide if we're prey."
Malus straightened in the saddle, and after a moment's thought, put his crossbow away and drew his sword.
"Time to snarl back,"
the Highborn said to the Druki beside him.
"Keep your crossbow ready. I'm going to try to shake them up a bit."
The Druki nodded, his eyes wide. Malus took a deep breath and spurred his mount forward. Spite, sensing the presence of the unseen creatures, let out a loud, rumbling growl. Branches snapped and heavy footfalls echoed from the darkness ahead. Malus walked Spite forward, feeling the Noglier grow increasingly tense. The beast's tail began to lash angrily, and the Highborn caught sight of something large nosing through the thick brush almost directly ahead of him. Malus edged Spite closer to the thing. Predictably, the Noglier let out a long, furious bellow at it, a cry that was quickly taken up by the rest of the Cold Ones in the column.
"You see?"
Malus thought.
"We're not some timid deer for you to slay. Best you seek less deadly prey."
Just then, Malus caught sight of a flash of movement off to his right. He turned sharply, but all he could see was a glimpse of something large slipping swiftly through the brush past him, heading for the rest of the party.
"They're much stealthier than they'd led me to believe,"
Malus thought with amazement.
"That means the one in front of me is just a distraction."
At that moment, the creature facing Malus let out a wild shriek and charged forward like a rampaging boar. The sounds answered by thunderous cries further up the path. Brush and saplings exploded in the monster's path as it charged the Highborn, and Malus could feel the air curdle at its approach. Monstrous as it was, the creature exuded an aura of palpable wrongness that even Spite's senses picked up on, causing the Cold One to shy backwards with a startled howl. Then the monster burst onto the path, and even the Highborn cried out in fear and disgust at the abomination that reared before him. It was huge. Easily as huge as Spite, its body little more than a lump of cancerous flesh and muscle supported by 4 trunk-like legs. Long, narrow arms terminating in scythes of exposed bone lashed at Malus, severing tree limbs and tearing huge gouges from tree trunks in their path. There were no eyes, nor even a face that Malus could recognize, only a round, lamprey-like mouth, and the end of a thick, muscular trunk. Rings of barbed teeth pulsated in ranks down the monster's throat, as its sphincter-like esophagus dilated and expelled a maddened roar at the Highborn and his mount.
"Dark Mother preserve us!"
Malus exclaimed in horror as he hauled on Spite's reins. The twisted monstrosity rushed at Malus as Spite wheeled around and struck it with his powerful tail. The blow staggered the monster, knocking it into a huge oak that splintered under its weight. Scything limbs lashed at the Cold One, but Malus was already putting the spurs to Spite's flanks, heading back up the path as fast as he dared. More of the twisted creatures had burst from the woods onto the path. Malus could hear the hysterical screams of the Druki he'd spoken to only moments before. One of the monsters had leapt upon the man's Cold One, pinning it to the ground with its 4 clawed legs and slashing it to a bloody ruin with his scythe-like arms. Malus could see the Druki's still kicking legs as the monster forced the armored warrior down its fanged throat. With a furious cry, Malus spurred his mount harder, directly at the hideous monster.
I can play that game as well,
he thought wildly. At the last moment, he hauled on the reins and cried, "Up!" Spite leapt onto the monster, taloned feet slashing and scrabbling for purchase. The monster seemed to distend beneath the Cold One's weight, flattening out as though it possessed no skeleton at all. Ichor sprayed from grotesque wounds as an Oglir's thick talons ripped away gobbets of butchered flesh. But it was like clawing a part of a midden heap. Malus slashed with his sword, his gorge rising at the stench of rot in the air, and the creature howled and gobbled with rage, slashing wildly with his arms. Finally, Spite's talons gained purchase, and the Cold One leapt over the monster. Just as its packmate came lumbering up from behind, Malus sped along the path, daring only a single backward glance to see the mortally wounded monster pushed aside by its packmate so it could continue the chase. The warband was in full flight, trying to break out of the trap. Malus could see the lashing tails of the running Noglir up ahead, past loping, gelid bodies bristling with bony scythes and talons. The Highborn ducked low in the saddle, sword raised, and let Spite shoulder the monsters out of his path. The Cold One crashed into, and in some cases through, the monsters' gluttonous bodies, showering Malus with evil-smelling fluids, but in moments they had broken free of the pack and were pulling away. Howls of rage and hunger shook the dark trees and seemed to fill the air from every direction. As surprisingly fast as the monsters were, they were far from nimble, while the Cold Ones negotiated the twisting paths with ease. In minutes, the warband had pulled away from its pursuers, but the monsters seemed tireless, never slacking their pace. Malus worked his way swiftly up the head of the column. Lenara rode with a stained sword in each hand, her eyes wild with a mix of terror and battle lust. The Highborn saw that the Beastman was gone.
What happened to the guide?
Malus yelled.
It leapt for the trees as soon as the ambush started. I couldn't stop it.
Malus uttered a blistering curse.
Keep your eyes peeled for branches off the path,
he cried.
Those things can't keep up with us. If we can turn off, we will. Otherwise, we'll see if they tire and give up.
But the minutes stretched, and the monsters refused to give up the chase. The Noglir were racing tirelessly along, but Malus knew that even the rugged Cold Ones had their limits.
Why are they still chasing us?
The Highborn thought.
They can't catch us. It should be obvious by now.
Just then, Malus was startled by a wash of chaotic light overhead. The path was plunging down into a mountain hollow, the trees receding substantially on either side of a dark, narrow stream.
More room to maneuver, at least, Malus thought. If I could direct the entire warband as a single unit, we might have a chance against these things.
Malus's mind raced, devising tactics as he waved the column into a ragged line and continued to race up the hollow. They'd covered 100 yards when howls and battle cries erupted from the woods on either side of them, and a horde of beastmen came charging out of the shadows beneath the trees, waving axes and clubs in the air.
Hounds to the hunter,
Malus realized, his heart growing cold.
Those creatures were driving us down the path to their masters.
In the darkness and chaos, there was no way to know how many beastmen there were. But it was clear that the Druki were far outnumbered and pressed from every side. In the thick of battle, Malus made the only decision he could. He raised his blade.
Forward!
He cried. The Cold Ones put their heads down and charged deeper into the hollow. The beastmen closed in behind them and took up the chase, and the wall of foes ahead rushed at the Druki in a ragged line. The charging knights met the beastmen with a crunch of bone and the wickering ring of steel against flesh. A beastman disappeared beneath Spite's taloned feet with a hoarse scream. Malus slashed at another howling ram's head, nearly as tall as himself, severing the horned head from its thickly muscled neck. Blood splashed across his armor, but Malus welcomed its bitter taste after the horrid ichor of the chaos-spawn monsters in the forest. A heavy blow rang against the left side of his breastplate, and Malus slashed at the head of another beastman, hacking away part of one curving horn. Another foe leapt at him from the right, swinging an axe that missed his thigh and bit into the cantle of his saddle instead. The Highborn responded with a backhanded slash across his attacker's eyes. The foe dropped his axe and reeled backwards, his hands reaching for his ruined face. Malus spurred Spite forward, bowling over the beastmen in front of him and breaking bones with the Noglir's lashing tail. A clawed hand grabbed for the reins, and Malus severed it at the wrist. An axe blade glanced from his armoured thigh, and a club smashed into his backplate, knocking him forward against the saddle. Then Spite leapt free of the press and charged farther up the hollow, momentarily leaving the beastmen behind. A quick glance showed that the rest of the warband had fought their way clear as well, staggering up the hollow in a rough line alongside him. Skill, experience, and heavy armour had won through, but the enemy was far from finished. Malus pointed to a scattering of boulders up ahead. "Form a line there and ready your crossbows!" he ordered. The Druki raised their swords in acknowledgement and spurred ahead for the rocks. They had gained perhaps 30 yards on the beastmen. Malus glanced back over his shoulder and saw that they were close to 100 left, loping along in a disordered mob and howling at the sky. Worse, he could see the pack of scythe-armed monstrosities shambling up the hollow in their wake. He thought they could break the beastmen with a few sharp volleys and another charge, but even the cold ones were frightened of the misshapen creatures. "Still, if we hurl the beastmen back upon their hounds, it might buy us some manoeuvring room," he thought. "Though even then, our prospects look grim." Malus reached the rocks beside his warriors. "Make ready to fire," he said. 3 volleys and then we charge. We'll try to break the animals and slip past their monsters in the confusion." Just then, a horn wailed from the bottom of the hollow, a deep, banshee-like howl that echoed through the trees. Malus stood in his saddle and saw another dark knot of beastmen break from the trees to the west, weaving torches over their heads. "Another 50, perhaps," he thought grimly. "We're going to pay dearly for this one." Then, to Malus's surprise, he saw the newcomers hurl large sacks or bladders at the backs of the shambling monsters. Torches followed, and suddenly the pack was wreathed in leaping blue flames. An angry shout went up from the beastmen farther up the hollow, and confusion reigned as the torch-wielding beastmen charged up the hollow at them. Several of the Druki cheered in relief. Lunara turned to Malus. "What in the outer darkness is happening?" Malus shook his head. "I have no idea, but I'll thank the Dark Mother for her gift." Below, the 2 mobs of beastmen had crashed together, and sounds of battle filled the air. The Highborn turned to his warriors. "Check your crossbows and make certain they're fully loaded. We'll advance at a walk and fire into the melee." Lunara frowned. "Who do we aim at?" "Who cares? They could all be foes. We'll kill as many as we can and worry about the rest when the time comes." Malus sheathed his sword and reached for his crossbow. "Ready! Advance!" The Cold Ones made their way slowly back down the hollow. The Druki raised their crossbow, choosing targets. "Fire at will!" Malus ordered, and the slaughter began. Crossbows thumped and bolts hissed through the air. In the darkness and the swirling melee, it was difficult to see the effects of their fire. The Druki reloaded and fired again. At the third salvo, the ranks of beastmen seemed to waver. Then suddenly, a ripple of cold curdled the air around the creatures, and Malus felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. "Sorcery!" the Highborn thought. Battle cries turned to wails of despair, and a large knot of beastmen threw down their weapons and ran, heading straight for Malus and his warband.
Fire at will!
Malus ordered. He sighted on a running beastman and put a bolt in the center of his chest. The Druki worked their weapons with a quick, brutal efficiency, loading, firing, and loading again. They'd killed nearly a score of the beastmen when they realized the peril in front of them and scattered, running for the safety of the trees to the east and west. Malus sighted on a running beastman and fired, punching a bolt into the creature's back.
Cease fire!
He ordered as the beastman crashed to the ground. Farther down the hollow, the torch-wielding beastman had finished off the last of their opponents and were now advancing uphill. In their lead, Malus could see a huge beastman bearing a massive staff and wearing a heavy robe draped over his sloping shoulders. The Highborn studied the advancing mob carefully. They seemed wary, but not overtly hostile. On impulse, he put his crossbow away.
I think they're coming to talk, he said to Lenara. Hold the men here. If something goes wrong, come and get me.
Yes, my lord,
Lenara said, but the choked expression on her face spoke eloquently of her real opinion of Malus's plan. The Highborn put the spurs to his mount and trotted across the corpse-strewn ground to meet the newcomers. The beastman sorcerer grunted a command to his fellows as Malus approached. Then he and one other continued their advance. The pair worked their way among the fallen beastmen until they stood approximately 10 yards ahead of the torch-wielding mob. Malus stopped within easy hailing distance and showed his empty hands.
Well met, stranger,
he called, realizing too late that the beastman probably didn't understand a word he was saying.
It appears my enemy is your enemy. Do you have a name?
At that, the second beastman stepped from behind the sorcerer, and Malus was shocked to see that it was his former prisoner. The beastman raised itself up to his full height and pointed dramatically at the towering sorcerer. Malus's eyes went wide. He'd been wrong all along. Kul Hadar wasn't the name of a place at all. The sorcerer tossed his horned head and smiled.
Hail, Druki,
the sorcerer rumbled in guttural Druhir.
I am Kul Hadar.